Kreisky.
Welcome to Kreisky's Wohnzimmer, the former Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky's living room. Welcome Soli Özel, Professor Özel from Istanbul. Great to have you here.
Good to be here, Walter. And good to be in this room. I wish we could also show the garden.
Yeah, even with this beautiful weather. The topic we would like to talk today is not so nice like the weather and the garden. It is about the strong man and its problems. The strong man in the Middle East, or the stable dictatorships, those who have been said to be in crisis, in eternal crisis, or washed away since the so-called Arab Spring, which, by the way, some people in the Middle East call the Islamist awakening.
Who calls it Islamist awakening?
The whole Iranian and the whole Iranian resistance
axis.
They
would, wouldn't they? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, from their perspective, logic. When that's what I found so fascinating. You are in a room with people who lived through these changes, who saw Egypt in 2010, who saw this all. And whilst for some it is so clear that this is an Arab Spring against authoritarian rule, others say, well, of course it is, because it's an Islamist awakening.
Right.
And I think we will come to this issue of the weaknesses and the role political Islam, or whatever is dubbed as political Islam, later on. But what do we take after more than 10 years so-called Arab Spring? The mood in the West is sober. There's not the flourishing democracy they hoped for to see. And
if they did hope for it, okay.
That is something I leave up to you to explain to us. But also it seems to be an almost strongman nostalgia, at least in security circles, because the strongman was strong and sorted out things. Now your argument, if I understood you right, is the strongman isn't strong any longer, so then who needs a dictator who can't dictate? Is that in a guess?
Well, first of all, you've asked too many questions. I'll try to answer them one by one. To begin with, you know, how we name something reflects our own biases. You know, the name Arab Spring was an allusion to the Spring of Nations from 1848, the revolutions of 1848, or the Prague Spring.
Yeah.
And that means the way you analyze, the way you identify and analyze those events are therefore Eurocentric. I personally prefer, rather than Arab Spring, I prefer the Arab revolts. This was an urban revolt. Almost everywhere it has taken place, it was an urban revolt. Demographically, it reflected 18 to 35-year-old urban, educated, younger parts of the population. The Islamists have jumped on board much, much later. But they certainly benefited from its consequences. And there is no doubt that 10 years later, in fact almost now, 11 years later, there is really not much left of the hopes, aspirations, optimism of that period. And it appears from the behavior, from the conduct and from the approach of Western countries, that they are not unhappy that the uncertainties associated with that period of upheaval has been replaced by something that is more recognizable, as you said, the rule of the strong man. Sisi in Egypt, now the Tunisian president is spoiling what used to be considered the only successful example of the Arab revolts in terms of its outcome. And I suppose they are also desperately looking for one in Libya in order to put it all together. And of course, one other, but I would argue that the aspirations, the hopes, and the optimism may have been depleted But the problems that actually gave birth to those revolts are there. They're not disappearing. In fact, some of them have probably been exacerbated. One other reason maybe as to why the Westerners prefer this is what had happened in Syria. Mm-hmm. Syria has also begun as a very hopeful thing. And it is with great pain that I admit this, that brutality won. Bloodthirstiness won. Cruelty won. And you have now a destitute country where I understand about 90% of the population live below poverty. Half the population had been displaced, some of them internally displaced, some of them had to flee and find refuge in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, mm-hmm. and those who are slightly luckier may have made it to Europe and then created other problems for Europeans themselves, which is also another reason as to why the Europeans look up to strong men who would actually keep those troubles away from their territories. Maybe for the moment this works. I don't think it will work for a long time. But what that long time actually is, that's, I don't know.
Could we go back a little bit to these root causes of the revolts? For any root cause, there are two elements in the state. One is the general population, the creative classes, the intellectuals, those who are whose hopes are disappointed because they cannot even get an ordinary job as a clerk for the government institutions and so on. But the other side is the way how the ruling classes, call them a dictatorship, call them sometimes they're a real junta of the military, sometimes they do differently, manage these hopes. Usually regimes, if this term is appropriate, maybe you may say something about this toxic midlife term, manage to get the intellectuals separated from the desperate ones. So a bread uprising because of hunger and poverty is, for instance, in Algeria, as it very often happened, they were always trying to keep the educated, the classes, the managerial classes, separate from the destitute. What happened in around 2010 that things went, because they're managing. These regimes know how to deal with their population in a brutal way. What happened back then?
Okay, in fact, maybe in order to give a better background, nobody in December of 2010, even the most leftist observers and analysts of the Middle East, of the Arab Middle East, expected such an upheaval. Then suddenly, one match, somebody self-emulating in a little, probably God-forsaken place, Mohammed Bouazizi, sparked a revolt that encompassed almost the entirety of the Arab world, more successfully in Republican Arab countries and less successfully in the monarchies, and partially many of the monarchies also had a lot of resources that they could just throw on their populations in order to quell their problems. And for years, almost decades now, all those who wrote about the Middle East wrote about survival strategies of those regimes, which everybody knew were corrupt, which everybody knew were very authoritarian, which everybody knew couldn't care much less about their own population's needs, and they seemed to have no concern as to the governance of the populations over which they were presumably the rulers. And for every period, these regimes appeared to have a strategy which would allow them to survive. And suddenly, in December, January of 2010, 2011, something has seemed to have given in, okay? It all collapsed. Now, in retrospect, of course, when you look, I'm putting Tunisia as a separate case because it was demographically different, its urban population was different, the role of this military in the system was very different, and it was not a strategically important place. Therefore, you could actually let things happen there, except for the French, perhaps, who actually wanted to intervene on behalf of the dictator Zeyn El Abidine bin Ali. But when you look at the Egyptian case now in retrospect, you really don't you wonder what game the military played. They wanted to get rid of Mubarak. They probably did not instigate what had happened in Tahrir Square on the 25th of January, but they certainly put it to good use for themselves.
Let's come back to this point. Could it be that part of this revolt, which makes them successful, is simply because the strongman in charge was simply in retirement age, past due retirement age? Look at Mubarak, Gaddafi also, he wasn't the youngest any longer, in a way. Bin Ali also, I mean, these are people who are
they have all outstayed their welcome.
Outstayed their welcome in a way. Gaddafi from the last years is definitely a different friend from 1970, where he had all this favor. And so to speak, because you hinted on this, that the military wanted to get rid. Yes, but then it would mean that the first ones to jump on the bandwagon of revolt, which were sparked individually, was this, people in the political elites, before even the Islamists came in.
The political elites did not really jump on board. They just let things happen. And they have created the conditions, especially when Barack Obama, the patron of the Egyptian dictator at the time, calls him and says, maybe it's time for you to go. And obviously he did not know, he no longer had as much support domestically from his own military, because the military opposed Mubarak's plan to actually put to the throne his own son, Gamal Mubarak. So, if you will, a popular upheaval gave the military not the excuse perhaps, but the condition that they could actually manipulate in order to get rid of the person that they no longer wanted, number one. And second, of course, there was still a disarray, and there was the aspirations, and you went to the polls. And the Brotherhood came to become the ruler of Egypt. And that strikes me, quite frankly, as an extraordinarily interesting phenomenon. Your Iranian friends may have thought, because the Brotherhood got elected, that this was an Islamist awakening. The Brotherhood jumped on board much later. In fact, the Brotherhood itself was divided among the younger generations who wanted to be participants from the initial days, and the old guard that didn't. And obviously the old guard was so devoid of any sense of what Egyptian society was like, especially the urban youth. We've seen it in power. And what really I find thoroughly perplexing is how the Brotherhood, which finally attained power after 83 years after it was founded, had no clue about how to run Egypt. They had no clue about the distribution of power in the Egyptian structure. They had no sense of governance, and their priorities really had nothing to do with the priorities, especially of those who aspired for a freer, for a better governed Egypt. I mean, we tend to think these were all democratic revolts, but the demands are mainly for better governance rather than democratic rights. I mean, the better governance may have encompassed all of that, but they basically wanted to be treated as citizens by their rulers. And unfortunately, given how badly the Brotherhood failed as well, and the brutality of the regime that replaced them, with great help from, of course, Saudi Arabia, the main counter-revolutionary force, along with the United Arab Emirates, has given us probably the most brutal dictatorship Egypt has ever experienced since the coup of 1952 by the free officers. And here we are. And in that sense, of course, in Egypt, counter-revolution won. In other countries, it was quelled. In Bahrain, the Saudis actually suppressed it. In Yemen, it led now to a massive, disastrous civil war. And of course, in Syria, the regime, with great help from those great revolutionaries in Iran, had managed to actually brutally suppress a revolution. And of course, what has begun once more as a desire to have better governance, to have a responsive government, ended up in bloodshed and it gave the regime the excuse to do whatever it did because the jihadis have taken over what started as I said, as an opposition movement that aspired to things that were totally different. And of course, the jihadi rage had also pushed many other segments of the population, most importantly, the Alawites, the Christians, and secular Sunnis say, no, if that is the alternative, we don't want it. We don't like this regime, but we obviously have to support them. And the West kind of mismanaged I think the Syrian file, maybe it could not have succeeded at all. And we end up with a situation which is worse than where we were back in 2011, certainly in Egypt and in Syria.
It's also very interesting to see that in those countries with the great ethnic homogeneity, like in Libya or in Egypt, the change was possible. Whereas in Syria, it was much easier for the regime to point to work on divides and to say, if we are going, you will be killed by them, and so on. So this seems to be one pattern.
But also...
But it's not enough as an explanation.
But you see, in Syria, what we've also seen was Syria's or the Syrian population's demands for a better government. Once the regime decided to resist, very rapidly turned into a geopolitical struggle, which presented itself as a sectarian battle.
Yeah,
and the heterogeneity of the Syrian population obviously served those who wanted to fight that battle along those lines. And of course, next door Iraq had that in a very brutal fashion from 2006 or from 2004 till about 2007, 2008.
Let's go back to ground zero of all the protests. That is a good governance, or better, the lack of systematic torture, corruption, and so on. If we take this as the first guiding principle of what happened in the last 20 years, then we would see huge civic demonstration in 2007 in Turkey. 2009, 2007, when the Cumhuriyet meeting, Larry. Yes, these were also, it was not anti, they were positive, the agenda, but it was at the core was about good governance and no hostility. I mean, it was very peaceful. But then we see 2009 in Iran, what started as a protest against the fraudulent elections turned out to be much broader. Not even with an agenda, you have to go, but you have to behave, which is, I think, very remarkable. It is not, in a way, it's a real revolutionary demands, we're going to change the system. No, there is a system, imperfect as it is, but we want the government, the authorities to abide by the rule and to and by their own rules, by the way. And similar things happened in Tunisia and so on. So I think this core demand is in a way, because there's a standard speech in the West where we say, yeah, good governance you should do also, or but this core demand in a way comes up again in the last months in Iraq. We want to have a good, and it doesn't go away. It's persistent.
No, that's what I meant when I said the aspirations, the optimism, and the hopes may have gone away for the moment, but the reasons as to why those people rebelled remain. Mind you, Arab revolts were probably the most spectacular, the most surprising specimen of something that actually encompassed the entire world from 2004 onwards. It started with the color revolutions.
Yes.
It continued with the economic crisis that then led to revolts in Greece, Italy, Chile, Brazil, Turkey, and Hong Kong. You know, remember the umbrella thing? So, if you will, in that sense, maybe it was akin to 1848 in that it was a universally present movement, rebellion. And they all had actually a common feature as well. A compatriot of mine, Zeynep Tüfekçi, who is now in the United States, had actually compiled, I think, trillions of tweets and Facebook messages and stuff like that, and analyzed them. And what was common to them is, one, the demographic thing, that is educated urban youth between the ages of 18 and 35 and all that. But there was also something else. These were all movements that had no political goals, no political leadership, no political program, and no political channel. And that was their demise. Look at Egypt. The secular camp just did not have a political program. And they lost out to those who presumably had, if not a political program, they certainly had a political organization. Okay, and who was the other candidate against Morsi? A core personality from the old regime. And what was the difference? 1 percentage points. Okay, so I think the Arab revolts were there at the time when there was really hope. What they suffered from was the fact that there was no politically organized. There was no political organization that could channel that energy and turn it into a political program, and therefore it failed. By the way, COVID intervened, and COVID's intervention, of course, changed a lot of things in the world, accelerated a lot of things. But remember, right before COVID struck, you had demonstrations in the Sudan. You had every Friday demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations in Algeria, which, if nothing else, succeeded in getting a half-dead man out of the presidential contest. And as you've just reminded us, again, right before COVID, people in Iraq basically wanted a non-sectarian regime. People in Lebanon,
even people with a sectarian background wanted a non.
Exactly. And what we've seen is, you know, the civil war in Iraq after the disastrous, criminal American invasion in Iraq, I would say, which led to the fragmentation of the Iraqi state and the sectarian war, and gave us ISIS, by the way, and the similar thing in Syria and all that, led the populations to seek protection. And they could only find that protection not at the state level, not at the national level, but at subnational or sub-state level. The tribes, the sects, the religious denominations, okay? And because that also didn't deliver, I think the demonstrations before COVID in Iraq, in Lebanon and whatever, what they were suggesting was, okay, we really need to have organizations or demands beyond sectarianism. This will not help us. So they were becoming national movements, that is, more unifying, more inclusive movements, and unfortunately, the virus intervened. And then, of course, in the Iraqi case, the Iranians who didn't like that made sure that the non-sectarian dimension would be quelled by the help of their own, of militias that they supported or that they founded, that worked actually for them rather than the Iraqi population of which they were part. But I suspect that sooner or later this will, I don't follow Sudan, so I will not say, I will not make a fool out of myself, but obviously something is going on there, right? The military comes up with a coup, then the population protests, and then the civilian guy is brought back, he now resigns. Something is happening. In some sense, even in a place like Sudan, you really cannot hold the system together as you used to. And in the Egyptian case, it requires a lot of brutality and a lot of material support from abroad.
You just said before that these civic movements lacked a political machine, lacked a strategic vision, not a moral and political vision, but a strategic vision. We do now this and that and so on. And still, they survived there because the core demands are strong. Could it be that the lack of a political machinery isn't even to their advantage? Because given the brutal nature of the regimes in question and of their enemies, they just needed the name lists and so on. The more you're organized, the more you're vulnerable. Because with the underground organization and so on, so it doesn't go away. The hope doesn't die because there is not like in the old days where you had a communist party somewhere in the underground broken down and then the organization comes back. But it still remains. And all the other forces, I mean, the Shiite militias of 2014 are totally different from today in narrative, in legitimacy for their own members. Okay. Just to point at one reason. And it seems to me that even if the virus intervened in its own peculiar way, and it gave the security apparatuses and the regimes or whoever another chance, the core demand, as you remarked, doesn't go away, and they have to answer. It comes back again. You can't just say, we censor all the newspapers, you don't talk about good governance any longer. Okay, so slightly a hope because you're not organized.
Look, but we may be talking about two different things. The point I was trying to make about the absence of a political program was when the Arab revolts have taken place. Yeah. That's when the regimes, no matter how manipulative the military in Egypt may have been, were actually vulnerable, but there was really no force to take over because there was no political program, number one. And number two, the Egyptian, let's say, quote-unquote, secular opposition had also been trapped because of their objection to what the Brotherhood was trying to do actually pushed them to the lap of the military, if you will. Had they had a political movement, had they really had a political program, maybe they would not have fallen into that trap, is what I'm saying. But of course, again, to come back to the initial point, the complaints are still in place. The demand for better governance is still in place. But we've got to recognize, I don't know about Iraq now, it's a question mark, but in a place like Lebanon, the elites are so corrupt and so insensitive to the demands of their own populations that the World Bank declares that Lebanon has the worst economic crisis on record in the last 120 years. We're talking about one of the most intelligent, one of the most resourceful populations anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East, which is being betrayed, brutally betrayed by its own elites. And in that sense, it's a very pessimistic picture. And the same goes for Egypt as well. That is, a lot of people are trying to leave Egypt, and those who stay cannot really speak up. In Algeria, things are quiet for the moment. In other parts, the regimes manage. The Moroccan regime does manage. I guess the Jordanian regime, always under pressure, somewhat managed. And the real nimble ones are the ones in the Gulf. And we do have, whether we like the guy or not, we do have a major experiment in Saudi Arabia of turning the family trust into a modern state. He may or may not succeed. There are plenty of reports that there is a lot of disenchantment and discontent among the princes, and if the king dies, he may not find support. I really don't know, but what I see is he is trying to establish what we called in European history an absolutist state, And I guess those things do necessitate some kind of brutality, but he may have gone overboard. He has tortured his own cousins, obviously, and that created a lot of resentment and a lot of, I'm sure, violent objection. How it will all unfold is yet to be seen. But, and I also look at Iran, which is probably the most vibrant society in the Middle East that I can follow. And there as well, 2009, 2017, 2019, you have rebellions or you have objections on different segments of the population, but at the end of the day, a regime which is well entrenched responds, crushes them, and you really cannot go forward. When will it again explode? Whether it will be successful, all those are basically not, to me, are unknown yet.
Yeah. Whilst there are so many similarities, there is still, all the states have still their own internal workings, ethnic compositions, confessional composition. But still, I think the core point you made at the beginning, this demand for good governance, is there. And
it
is
will
there
not go
to
away.
stay. And we knew that it has, in a way, always been there. But 2 decades earlier, you could talk about national security, so we don't talk about human rights, because this is national security. Or you make it a sectarian or confessional or ethnic question, and so on. You could replace it. Are we at the point of no return that even the worst, be it a dictator or whatsoever, has at least to pay lip service to the discourse of, if not human right, good governance, or to promise to legitimize, because that would be different. Early on, we have all these great talks about ideological, confessional, or whatever talks. But I just take Iran as an example because I know it so well. 20 years ago, Mr. Khamenei would not talk so much about good governance. Now it's almost weekly. Now there is governance, certainly, and compared to others, Iran might be better off, but that's beyond the point. That good governance becomes the accepted the accepted trademark. You have at least to pay lip service to it. That would
you pay lip service to it, and I think an associated concept is justice. Mm-hmm. Because and that's, by the way, not just a Middle Eastern thing. It's, I think, universal everywhere. Justice is being demanded by populations because everybody sees everything. Look, for me, I mean, I guess, a modernist, and I still look at the world from the perspective of the slogan of the French Revolution, you know, liberté, fraternité, liberté, égalité, fraternité. In a way, the last 40 years, because of the economic philosophy that was adopted by almost everyone, or imposed on everyone, it was about freedom, and it was about individual freedom, and it was turning citizens into economic actors. Given the fact that, including in Europe, which is the most egalitarian part of the world, inequalities inside countries have just shot through the sky, equality is going to be the principle that will organize all sorts of political movements, one way or another, and of course it is very intimately related to the concept of justice. That will define, in my judgment, the political developments of the next decades in the world, and definitely in the Middle East as well. Look, Egypt had a population of 82 million, I think, back in 2011. It now has a population of 102. And with declining water resources, desertification and stuff, this is not tenable. This is not tenable. And all the other, I mean, Syria, without the drought, you cannot really understand the brutality of the civil war. All of those countries are going to be running out of water. Yemen is going to be the first country that will run out of water. So put governance aside, how are people going to be able to survive is going to be a major issue. and you really cannot do all that much with bayonets or torture chambers and stuff. You've got to find another way of approaching this. I hope that they will, but I'm not holding my breath for the short run.
Water and climate issues or other ecological issues are certainly worth another topic. We're gonna do something on this in the future, because it's unavoidable, and the answers on it are very, very unclear. But equality is also, it's very interesting to point it out, because the modern nation state, which was created in the Arab world and in Turkey and Iran, was actually a concept of at least equality of chances. Yeah. Reality looked differently, but equality of chances. Schools and so on, of course, they were heavily ideologized and integrated. Many, especially minorities, would not see themselves in the curriculum. The language is often prescribed. But by and large, the concept of equality of chances was there, even in practice. It was tenable. You could see it. You could see it. You could see also the national efforts, whether from the right or from the left, or monarchies or republics, they tried to. And there, I think it's, I would like to learn what you say, the decay of the schooling system in these countries.
Not only that, it's the privatizations.
Is it the privatizations only?
No, it's not, but it's all a package, right? I mean, the Egyptian state, for better or worse, in the 1950s, for its own self-legitimation, decided to give every graduate of a university a job. And in an unproductive country, that meant you all got jobs in the colossal Egyptian state, and the Egyptian state can no longer afford this, so it says, let the market take care of this, okay, in that sense. And by the way, the quality of the education has declined, the opportunities have declined, the economic inequalities made sure that a poor person would not get the same chances as the others and all that. So it came, I mean, the neoliberal economic policies come with a philosophy, and in that philosophy, those who are at the bottom, when the concept of the public good is no longer as pertinent, then they just go by the wayside, and they don't get the education they deserve, they don't get the services they deserve, and all of that. It perpetuates inequalities. Again, the Middle East, North Africa region is the most unequal region in the world, according to the latest inequality report that is prepared by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Chaz and their colleagues.
And do you think that these liberal economies did affect all these countries in the same degree, or is it a key factor in all the countries, whatever the degree? How big it is, and how much does it relate to the governance decay, having always the same people in charge and so on? Or is this just something for case-to-case studies?
Well, I mean, those who have resources, look at the Gulf countries, they have a larger population that are expats than they have their own populations. But even in Saudi Arabia, people complain about having an education but not getting a decent job. But things are changing. They have many more resources, so their situation would be very different than in Egypt. Or I mean, look at Tunisia, a relatively small population. And 11 years after the successful transition of power, what do we find? The parts of the country that were suffering from poverty, lack of jobs, lack of opportunities to the south, are still under the same conditions, which is why they have finally decided, if democracy has not given us anything, why not try this guy who appears to be decent, who appears to be non-corrupt, and maybe he will deliver the goods. And in a way, this is also an illusion on the part of the populations that individuals can save them, and they don't see this as a systemic thing. But in the Tunisian case in particular, as well as the Egyptian case, also speak to one other factor, and that is how well entrenched, especially the economic elites are. And that is when the role of the West becomes so important. I mean, when Sisi gets the red carpet everywhere in Europe, including the most human rights defending president of Germany, the previous president of Germany. I mean, he does not have a political personality, obviously, as president. But, you know, it's a joke then. People in Europe should not be very surprised if the people in the Middle East are a bit cynical when it comes to principles and values and all those things. And sooner or later, it will have an impact on how those populations view the Westerners. But they're at an impasse because politics are about, but as Tip O'Neill, a speaker of the American Congress of House of Representatives, once said, all politics is local, and in democratic politics, the short run always trumps the long run. And the European leaders are trying to save the short run, avoid, let's say, immigration problems, because then that gives them the right-wing populism or authoritarian movements gaining strength among their populations. And we end up with the situation that we have, that is, Sisi is being treated as a major political leader, and everybody is in, how shall I say, in not awe of him, but maybe in his debt. And that's how things go until the system no longer holds. When that will come, that I don't know. But that it will come, I don't particularly doubt.
A decade ago in the European Union, politicians, especially from the parliament, would be enthusiastic about supporting the population, supporting democracy. Not much of this remained, even in the discourse.
No. Well, because remember, again, this is the trick that history plays on us, right? I mean, you have to remember Hegel, who said the owl of Minerva clips its wings after dusk. That is, we can really understand the true meaning of a historical period until after it's over. Yeah. And the moment of 1989 and the kinds of aspirations and hopes and visions that it gave birth to 30 years later don't look that realistic. Reality had presented us with a very different picture. Therefore, it had an impact on what the Europeans were expecting from other populations. Now, and I'll end with this. It's one thing to be disappointed, but it's another thing to say, you see, they were given a chance, then they did not succeed. That I find terribly condescending and very self-serving. So I'll leave it. It's like the Americans say, well, we fought Iraq and invaded it, and look at Iraq. We fought Libya but didn't invade it, look at Libya. We neither fought nor invaded Syria, and look at Syria. You know, the not so subtle message there is, these guys can't get their act together, okay? And I really find,
back to Huntington.
I really find that unnerving, quite frankly, and very condescending.
But it's also very convenient.
It's very convenient, yes.
Intellectually, politically.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, with that inconvenience, Ruth, thank you so much, Soli, for being here.
It's a pleasure, always.